afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our breakout session titled Leaving No One Behind in the Strive for Universal Health Coverage, a Fantasy or Reality. We're not so many in the room, so if you would like to come forward and sit a little bit closer to us, you're welcome to do so. We have a lot of empty seats up front and it might feel a little lonely, so please come forward if you'd like to. We're a little bit tighter group. So good afternoon, my name is Tomoko. I'm an advocacy manager at Joycef. We work in sexual reproductive health and rights. In this session, we're going to be talking about health. And for those of you who are not familiar from global health issues, at least half of the world's population still do not have full coverage of essential health services. Half of the world is quite a lot. About 100 million people are still being pushed into extreme poverty because they have to pay for health care. Over 800 million people, which is about 12% of the world population, will spend about 10% of their household budget to pay for health care. Now that's a lot of money, and that means a lot of people are going to be pushed into poverty just to access health services. With the SDGs, within Goal 3, universal health coverage has been adopted as one of the targets, and all the member states, heads of states, have agreed that universal health coverage is something that we must all achieve to achieve the SDGs. And the famous leaving no one behind catchphrase in the SDGs. So we've talked about it a lot, and it is the same with universal health coverage. We talk about it a lot. We don't want to leave anyone behind in achieving health services. However, when we look at the reality in front of us, are we really getting close to there? Are we really making sure that we are not leaving anyone behind? So in this session, in the next hour and a half or so, we would like to dig in further into what it means to leave no one behind. What is it that we can do to ensure that governments don't leave anyone behind? To start off this session, I'm going to invite Stefania Burbo, who is from a focal point Observatorio AIDS, the Italian network on AIDS, rights, and health, to give us a keynote in terms of the role of civil society and global health, before we start off our panel. So Stefania, please.
Everybody. And yes, just a few words on the involvement of civil society and communities. We have heard a lot about these topics, both yesterday and today. We have heard that civil society involvement is important because we have experts, and because we call governments to be accountable once they have made the commitments, and I would like to stress this, considering that we are within a G20 process, and also because we help people understanding laws. And we are not just watchdogs, but it is really useful to speak with governments. I would like to add another important, in my opinion, task for civil society, that is to sensitize institutions on changes going on in the society, as civil society is close to people's needs. Civil society, therefore, can identify strategies to be presented to institutions as best practice. In order to help understand you what I'm saying, I would like to quote an example that is a bit old because it is from the 70s in Italy, but really it could help you. In the 70s, the Italian feminist movement set up self-managed sexual and reproductive health centers. And then the Italian institutions, recognizing the importance of these health centers, incorporated them into the national systems with a law establishing family counseling centers. And I would like also to highlight a challenge. We spoke of this again in this Civil 20, of this challenge that is shrinking space for civil society. Also in Italy, we unfortunately are experiencing this challenge, because there is a trend of criminalizing NGO ships and volunteers involved in migrant boat search and rescue activities in the Mediterranean Sea. So that from being human rights defenders, NGO have become criminals colluded with human traffickers for some institutions, and that's very sad. Because it had a general negative impact on Italian NGOs. And now a best practice. I would like to speak shortly of the Global Fund, because it is a partnership of governments, private sector, civil society, and communities affected by the three diseases. And it was the grassroots efforts of thousands of civil society groups around the world advocating for increased resources for the response to HIV and AIDS that led to the creation of the Global Fund in 2002. And civil society actively participates in governance at the international level and also at local level. Of the 20 voting seats on the Global Fund board, 3 are held by civil society, and at the country level, civil society participates actively in the decision-making process through membership in the CCMs, the country coordinating mechanisms that are the national bodies responsible for creating the requests for funding and overseeing implementation. While it is still a challenge to ensure that everyone is able to contribute in a meaningful way, these organizations are increasingly making their voices heard. So I would like to conclude stressing that civil society and community involvement needs to be sufficiently resourced and legally enabled, and that we can't have universal health coverage without meaningful involvement of civil society. So our request to the G20 with regard to universal health coverage is to set clear, concrete, time-bound, costed and publicly communicated universal health coverage plans and targets developed through inclusive multi-stakeholder dialogue, including civil society. Thank you.
And paving the way in terms of our role as civil society in pushing for universal health coverage. So now I'd like to invite the moderator and our panelists up front. Today we will have 5 panelists. And first I'll introduce the moderator. We have Desta, who came from Kenya. She's the Director of Partnerships for Africa in AMREF, and she'll be our moderator today. So welcome, Desta. And we have 5 panelists, so I'll invite Kurt, who is the president of Fundación Huspe, please. Santosh, who is the director of Cocaterista. Rodolin, who is the executive director of APCASO. Rachel, who is the regional coordinator of Global Fund Advocates Network, Asia Pacific. And Hiroaki, who is the domestic coordinator of South Africa Project, Japan National Assembly of Disabled Persons. So I hand over the mic to Desta.
Actually, I'm going to stand here for a minute. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. In Africa, we say good morning, good afternoon. That gives us energy. It is such a pleasure to be here. As Tomoko said, my name is Desta Lako. I'm actually Ethiopian by birth and origin, living in Kenya currently, but having seen many different sides of this leave no one behind equation, I'm really pleased today to be here and to moderate and to facilitate a discussion which I hope will be interesting and engaging. So those of you all the way in the back, please do come up and join the conversation. So just to set the scene a little bit, we know that UHC means having access to equitable, affordable, and quality care. This is what we've been hearing all morning, throughout the whole day. And what that means is that no matter how far you live from a health center, no matter what community you belong to, and no matter who you are, you should be able to have access to quality health care. No one should be left behind. So this reaching the last mile is a very inspirational phrase. And what we are hoping today is that the session will unpack what needs to be done to make this a reality. The session will also reinforce the urgency of investing in reaching vulnerable, marginalized, and hard-to-reach population with affordable and high-quality care. You see, I said investing, right? Because health is an investment, it's not an expenditure. So just keep thinking about health as an investment and not an expenditure. From alma mater to Sustainable Development Goals to Global Conference on Primary Care in Astana, it seems that there has never been a greater alignment for global focus on the need to bridge the access and service delivery gaps that are experienced by the most vulnerable. However, I think there also needs to be more than just national declarations. There needs to be accountability frameworks that are affiliated or tied to these declarations so that we can make sure that reaching the last mile becomes a reality and not just a conversation that we have annually. So how do we pivot our health systems? How do we face some of the challenges that are related to this? Challenges such as equity, such as equality, such as poverty, health financing, political commitment, health security, global immigration. These are all things that reaching the last mile can sometimes touch upon. So how do we reach the unreached? And I'm really pleased today that we have some amazing speakers, panelists, and I'm hoping that we can learn some things from them. I'm hoping that they can share with us some of their thoughts. And so I will start first of all with Kurt Frieder. Kurt, I'm sort of tied here to the podium with this wire, so I can't really come and sit next to you unless they give me a mic if that's okay. So Kurt is, background is business administration, and he's also has a master's. He is co-founder of Fundación USPED and was its first president. Fundación USPED is an Argentinian organization with a regional scope that has been working in public health since 1989. So, Kurt, my question to you, there are so many lives that continue to be lost to preventable disease and treatable illnesses. Every year, we heard earlier that 100 million become poor due to out-of-pocket expenses, and they join the 767 million living in extreme poverty globally. So, if you can answer the following two questions. What are some of the constraints, challenges to ensure access to healthcare in urban slum areas? Who's living there? What are the issues around health system strengthening and infrastructure? And then, is there a role for informal sectors to bridge some of these, or even private sectors to bridge some of these gaps in public health outreach and demand generation? So.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much, Desta. Well, we have started. You asked me to start with these people living in slums, which are the most invisible of all the vulnerable groups that we usually treat or with whom we usually work. People living in slums come from many different places, but I would try to divide them in three groups. One is rural people that are moving to the cities because of poverty. Remember that poverty is SDG 1, or hunger, which is the SDG 2. That means that, and then the third one is SDG 3, health. But extreme poverty is the incapacity of people to obtain a basic food basket. And rural poverty is much less visible than urban poverty because most women, children, and indigenous people are the most affected groups. Rural poverty is the main driver for insecure movements to the cities. Another group that integrates people living in slums are those that are impoverished city dwellers that lost their work, their income and properties, and have no alternative than to live in these areas. And the third group is one of the big issues that we have to treat these days and has to do with migrants. Migrants that are looking for a better future sometimes, but also many migrants that are forced because of wars and persecutions, because of their political, religious, or ethnic reasons. Only in 2017 we had about 260 million migrants, which means 3.5% of the world population, migrating because of these reasons to the most developed countries. That has a demographic impact and unforeseen urban growth for the cities, really. Slums, really, and informal living are in developing countries the most visible manifestation of poverty. 70% of urban residents in low-income countries in the world are slum dwellers. Over 1 billion people. And all countries have slums everywhere, even the most rich ones. People are undocumented in many cases, without any resources and no formal work. They are the most vulnerable groups, really. People that become invisible, although slums are visible everywhere and uncomfortable to see in all big cities. As defined by the UN Habitat, slums lack basic services, have substandard and inadequate housing, overcrowding and high density, are unhealthy living conditions and hazardous locations, have unsafe water and inexistent sanitary conditions. Of course, also insufficient drainage and no disposal of waste, and stigma and exclusion because of lack of education in many, many cases. That makes them suffer of urban violence. People have assaults, rapes, sexual abuse, domestic violence, and have affected them disproportionately. They are especially vulnerable, people living in slums, to air pollution and climate change, mosquito-borne diseases like dengue, Zika, yellow fever. I want to remind you that the WHO just presented a list of 10 of the 10 biggest challenges for this year, and these ones that I'm mentioning have to do with these 10, really. HIV/AIDS and other sexually transmitted diseases, TB, malaria, the threat of any upsurging epidemic. They have weak primary health care and no facilities at all in the slums, and no social services. Actually, people living in slums are the most vulnerable group in the urban settings. And most of them are older persons, women and small children, which are particularly vulnerable and unable to reach the health services. Which are as you asked, what can we do? What has to be done? No? Well, the strategic actions required are, first of all, have to do with the government and public policies about urban planning and development, upgrade the slums and housing structures to include them in the cities, to build inclusive and age-friendly facilities, to improve free access to quality health care and health security facilities, to try to integrate welfare and education facilities, to ensure a better local governance, and finally to empower the communities to improve their quality of life. It's required an upsurge of grassroots and community organizations that will start eventually in those places. Life for those that requires a political commitment, while health, equity, and sustainable developments become core values.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. And actually that sort of leads us, the whole issue of close living, communicable diseases, waterborne diseases, all of those things, lack of empowerment, etc. Those are very important things that I think we need to make sure our community-based organizations are involved in. We need to ensure that there's political commitment to handle some of those things. So I think you raised some very good points. Thank you very much. And I'm going to move actually now to Roland Marte, RD, as we've been calling her. RD is a Filipino feminist activist with a passion for human rights, sexual rights, social justice issues. We've seen her on the dais a few times in the last day or so, so she probably needs a very little introduction. So RD, globalization, conflict, poverty, climate change, urbanization, inequality, and poor job prospects are among some of the reasons that people leave their homes in search of a better future. Many of us are immigrants also. So just in looking at migration and migrants themselves as some of the most vulnerable populations in our societies, can you speak on some of the key issues which need to be addressed in order to ensure that equity is achieved in delivering health services to this migrant communities? And then maybe also discuss very briefly some key challenges in the context of women in the migrant community. And then finally, I'll ask you one more thing, because I'd like all of you to at least cover most of the issues that we have. Perhaps you can also touch on advocacy and the role that advocacy can play in influencing policymakers and leaders to ensure that women's rights and those rights of immigrants, of course, are protected.
Thanks very much. I'm actually very pleased to have an opportunity to talk about a community or a segment of our population, which I feel that every one of us in this room is familiar with. We interact with them, but at the same time, the health issues and rights we have often overlooked. So quite in front of our faces, but quite invisible as well. And this is particularly the issue of migrant workers. But before I start, I would first like to begin to say that when we do talk about the issues of migrant workers, we have to keep in mind that they are not a homogeneous group. Within this community, there are subgroups, and the subgroups and the interaction of the different identities actually have a bearing on how vulnerable they are to health risks and how good or bad their access is to healthcare. So, for example, when I'm saying that there are subgroups even within the migrant community, we know that within migrant workers, there are those who are documented versus those who are undocumented. We never say, just to make a plug as well, that we never say illegal migrants because there's no illegal person, but there are migrants who are undocumented. We also know that there are internal migrants, migrants from within the country who transfer to another part in search of better options in life. There are also like male, as we know, versus female migrant workers, and again, the vulnerabilities would be different. We also know that there are migrant workers who are part of organized communities, peer communities, and those who don't. And of course, the identity of migrant worker, again, it cannot just be one, they would be interacting. I'm saying all this because we have to put in context. For example, imagine a female migrant worker from Burma or Myanmar working as a domestic health worker. domestic worker in Japan. Have that picture in your mind. And then imagine somebody else, a male migrant worker from the UK who's teaching at a school in Tokyo. Now imagine the health vulnerabilities that they face. Imagine the rest hour periods that they're entitled to. Imagine if they confront health issues, serious or not so serious. One is documented, one is not. Imagine which one of them is likely to just bear the brunt of health illnesses rather than face risk of deportation. Again, the differences in the stratospheres within migrant workers determine whether the migrants in the countries where they are working or where they are sent are treated as either second, third, fourth, fifth class, and so on citizens. Because migrant workers are never treated as first class citizens, we know that. Except in some cases when, for example, migrant workers from the global north migrate for work in the global south. So from developed to developing countries, because that's how the world that we live in is made of. Also, as I've said, the differences and the interaction of the different layers of the identities translate to the differences in health risks and vulnerabilities as well as access to services. So just having that background, just to, I guess, surface some of the key issues when it comes to migrant workers and their access to health and their health vulnerabilities. When you think about it, migrant workers actually face a number of similar struggles and challenges as other underserved populations in our society. But they face the additional barriers of one, mobility. So imagine before a migrant worker would reach a country of destination, she would have pre-departure procedures, and that's if she is actually documented. There is the risk associated for that in terms of extortion. There's also the, how they call this, the transit before he or she reaches the point of destination. There will be vulnerabilities in terms of sexual violence, etc., before she reaches the destination. When she or he reaches the destination, there are still additional barriers because we know that most often, especially for migrant workers who are not documented, they face barriers in actually being eligible to access public or privately financed healthcare systems. So health benefits that would apply to citizens of a country or to documented migrant workers of a country, sadly, do not often apply to undocumented migrant workers. Sometimes they also do not apply even to documented migrant workers. There's also the challenge of within the migrant worker community, documented or undocumented, belonging to so-called skilled or unskilled labor. In terms of lack of familiarity with the local healthcare services, there would always be language barriers and cultural differences. For many of us who travel from one meeting to another, there's some sort of savviness already, but imagine a person from a kampung, from a village, being thrown into another country and having to navigate the system into that country on top of being separated from the family. There's also the issue of incoherent policies when it comes to health as well as migration that confronts migrant workers. A case and example, the region where I come from, a sub-region is called the Mekong. So it consists of countries like Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, Burma, and there are programs that actually try to tackle cross-border malaria issues because the borders are by land. There are a lot of jungles and there are, the malaria endemic countries. So governments actually have an agreement to have Mekong level, that sub-region across 5 countries arrangement, so that the responsibility for malaria health programs for migrants doesn't only fall on the government whose citizens are getting sick, but throughout cross borders. So documented or not documented, the migrant workers are supposed to be able to have access to health services for free. That's what the malaria programs say. But what would happen even if that's the malaria programs say, but if the migration policies of each of the country are actually punitive, then the migrant workers would not actually access those services because they'll feel that if they have fever and they go to health centers, then they would just be caught by the authorities and be deported. So it's incoherent. I mean, it's well intended, but it doesn't make sense because they don't match. So migrant workers are on the move, but their healthcare not the best to begin with from the sending countries. Like for example, I come from the Philippines. I think we send about 200,000 migrant workers on a daily basis. Our airports are always full. Our health service systems in the country are not the best to begin with. The policies that are supposed to protect we call them the new age heroes of the country. That's how we call our migrant workers, but they don't exist. Like they're really treated like shit in the country and in the receiving countries as well. So again, fear of deportation and contact with government agencies make access to healthcare even more complicated, especially for undocumented migrants. And then throw into the scenario the issue of gender. So for example, women migrant workers, documented or undocumented, when a woman migrant worker, for example, leaves the country and she is supposed to already be married in the country, she would go to a destination country, loneliness or for whatever reason, she would have sex, but she wouldn't really have access to sexual and reproductive health services. Therefore, increasing her risk to pregnancy, unwanted pregnancy, also to sexually transmitted infection. If she gets pregnant or if she contracts sexually transmitted infection, then automatically she gets sacked and gets sent back to the country. When she gets sent back to the country, you could imagine again the added layers of discrimination that this will face. And again, I guess like this is just to draw on the fact that the issues that are being faced by migrant workers based on various levels of identities and of discrimination are complex, and therefore the solutions also need to be complex. How do we solve this? Quite easy now. No, I mean, how do we really make change happen? Like, how have marginalized communities gained ground in terms of, because the issues of migrant workers are cross-border issues and they require cross-border solutions. We all know from the stories that I'm sharing that the changes that need to happen are at the policy and at the legal level. And we all know that policies and legal changes wouldn't just happen on their own. They need advocacy. So, and it's the best if the advocacy actually comes from the network or from the community of people whose lives are affected. It's harder for migrant workers to organize because they're on the move. But at the same time, there are ways, there are examples, there are actually communities of organized migrant workers, and it has been demonstrating the effectiveness of that. There are some, just to demonstrate the importance of community organizing and community advocacy. I've lived in Malaysia. So in Malaysia, they really distinguish between blue-collar and white-collar workers. I received a gold card because I'm professional. The others received pink card. The government of the Philippines was trying to be protective of its domestic workers that they sent to other countries by imposing a minimum wage. So when Filipino workers, for example, work in Malaysia as domestic helpers, other nationalities would receive 700 ringgit, which is $200. Filipinos would receive the same. The Philippine government said, like, okay, we need to impose minimum wage, and that is out of goodwill. So they said, like, okay, others would receive 700 ringgit for Filipinos. We would impose, because we want to protect our Filipino workers, 1,200 ringgit. But at the same time, what happened is that, and Filipinos are very much in demand in Malaysia, but when there was the cap of that minimum wage, actually the migrant workers didn't like it because the employer stopped employing them. And what it did was, because they weren't consulted, it pushed them underground, so they went into non-contracts with their employers. So that just really demonstrates, like, even well-intentioned policies and programs could totally be irrelevant and even backfire if communities are not involved in the decision making. So policy change, and it happens through community advocacy. Community advocacy wouldn't happen if there's no actual support for community organizing and community mobilization. And that could only happen through funding and through other forms of support.
Thank you so much. You covered quite a bit, and maybe when we come down to the summarizing some key points, you and Kurt might opine on the issue of people who are coming from what is so-called fragile and conflict-affected states, and how that sort of ties in, because the FCAS discussion actually is not acknowledged by every country. In Africa, for example, if there's an issue in the DRC, we look at the DRC as a FCAS country, a fragile and conflict-affected country, but right next door, Rwanda will not consider itself an FCAS country, and therefore would not do some of the policy changes or advocacy that needs to be done to ensure these people are taken care of, since our borders are so porous. Yeah. So just think about how you would summarize that. I'm going to move now just to add, there's a few other groups that we are looking at in this last mile, no one left behind. And I mean, I don't think this young lady needs any introduction, really. Santosh Kumar Giri, she's the director of the Kolkata RISTI. She's been on the dais a few times already since we've been here, but she is a member of the CSEM, the Civil Society Engagement Mechanism of UHC 2030. She's on the steering committee. She's a member of CSO representative of community-based organizations. Quite a bit of work, and I've been having a really actually interesting discussion with her about the community that she cares for, the community that she's involved in. And the one thing I keep telling this young lady, Santosh, is she has a unique opportunity to represent the LGBTQ and trans community, and a voice that she should actually leverage broader, because in many countries, this is not an option. Speaking is not an option if you are from the LGBTQ and trans community. So Santosh, UHC at its best could provide a pathway to ensure the right to health for everyone. But oftentimes in this community, in the LGBTQ and trans community around the world, people are criminalized, they're often denied their rights. Those who are denied legal recognition and documentation include people who are in detention, transgender people, sex workers, people who use drugs, gay men and lesbians, and migrants. So I think there is an opportunity or a possibility for reviewing and repealing some laws and policies that violate human rights, as UHC can never be a reality for many of these people without equal access to opportunity and protection from violence, from discrimination, and from stigma. So I have two questions for you. Take your time. The first thing is, can you speak about some of the unique challenges that the LGBT community and the trans community, including discrimination, legal criminalization, etc., have, and what actions countries and policymakers need to take to ensure the safety of all of their citizens, not just this community, but all of their citizens as well, to access quality health services. And then the second question that I would ask you is, how can some of these communities be empowered themselves to take on policy matters and policy issues? And then what is the role of the CSOs, such as your own CSO, in advancing and advocating for this?
Thank you, Lester. Hello, everybody. Hello. Yes. So, thank you for the question. The first question is that the uniqueness. And we all aware that the uniqueness is that the discrimination is not far away from our steps, every steps, either starting from the east to west, north to south, or central. We, the person from LGBT community, are discriminated everywhere. Either you are from the high class people, red, black, anywhere. Doesn't make sense that you are from where, but the discrimination is everywhere. So that's the most important. But somehow the uniqueness is that also, which I feel today at the time of mourning, that we are very united. That is also very much giving us the platform. Either we are from any country, we don't know each other's languages, we don't know each other's faces, we're not familiar to each other, but the pain which we have is same and similar, and that makes us united. Yes, there's some places like in Africa, as you said that in India, yes, but some places in Africa and many places in all over the world, this LGBT people are criminalized till yet, and which cause they are killing, they are attempting suicide, they are facing discrimination. Not only that, they are facing rape, regular rape. And the most important, which I feel that either, suppose we are, as an example, we are in India and we are decriminalized that now from the Nalsa judgment. But again, the question is they are not giving us the legalization as a transgender. The legalization is for the third gender. Now the question, I don't know who are the first and second. Again, there is a question about OBC classes. They are not give us the judgment on our gender issue in the caste like this. We don't want that. We don't want to hijack anyone's from the OBC class over below caste. We don't want. We want our gender identity legalization, but the court do not. I don't know why the court do not understand. For the healthcare services, nowhere. Maybe the peoples are doing lots of works in all over the country, all over the world. Lots of HIV/AIDS peoples are doing lots of things, but nowhere till we are having the healthcare services in a friendly way, in a respected way, in the dignity way. I am from a country where the vote can be sold, but when we are going to pay for our healthcare, we are not getting the healthcare services, truly, in a dignity way. Okay, while you are in the queue, you have paid, but you sit it, let everybody can go, then you'll get the healthcare services. We facing the problems. I don't know what's wrong. What's wrong that we are like this? We always say, I have a note here, if the color of blood is same, then why discrimination on basis of sex, age, gender, ethnicity, religion, race? UHC for all, by leaving no one behind. But is it implemented? No, it's not implemented. We always see, many of us friends know me today. I was in a meeting there, and I was really disappointed in the first panel session. I asked a question, 5-6 friends are there, but none of them are answered me. And all of a sudden a gentleman comes to me and says, I will answer you later. Can it's possible for that? No, sir. I want an answer, and that's not in a private. What did you think about us? So that's most important, that where we are, from where, maybe we always think the people, those who knows English, those who have good in education, are getting good services. No, it's not that. So, and coming to your second question, and again, there is, if RD is very good points having, that, there are migrants. Does anybody have the data, clear data, how many LGBT people are migrants? No. I had spoke with the ILO, and they also said, no, we are on the process, but they don't have. Why? This big agencies knows that we exist, we are on the earth. This is our place also. Why we are like this? Why we are discriminated? So that's it. The second question is coming, as you said, first we will have to be inclusive everywhere. whatever it is. Because if you see the HGD, we are nowhere, that is everywhere we are. And they feel that we are very privileged. Okay, thank you, it's good if we are privileged, but we are nowhere, kindly put somewhere. Secondly, the policy I'm saying, if I'm saying about policy, there is no such policy for the LGBT people. Either starting from the big agencies like UN Women, UNDP or United Nations, or many agencies. They have just, if they have in the paper and pen, in the black and white, but it's not in the implementation in the, what I'll say, in the field or in their working level. It's just for the showing people that we have this gender policy. And as the community-based organizations, we know there are lots of people are in hidden population. And if we really want to empower the community, if we really want to take the community to speak for their policy, for their human rights, we should have to give the place to them. I know many international conferences and many where we are requesting as anything, so madam, please give us a place where we can speak. Why? We are not invited many places. So that is most important, we have to have our own place. We need, at this 21st century, we need empathy, love, support. We don't need sympathy. There must be the recommendation from the UN agencies, United Nations, WHO, World Bank, anywhere, that the no discrimination will be tolerated if any LGBT is facing. That recommendation is supposed to be there. The specific program on the LGBT community is to be implemented, and it's to be taken initiative by the community, for the community, by the community-based organization, and with the community. We don't need third party and second party inside that, because we know there are some few fundings is there for the LGBT people like MSM, and the gay people and our transgender people are accessing some HIV programs and all. And that is also coming through some third party, second party like that. We don't need that. We need the community empowerment, community involvement, grassroots level. The funders should know that they have to empower the grassroots level. Always the funder asking, whenever we fill the form, the funder asking, what is your turnover? Why? A small grassroots level organization is supposed to be get that place. And the last but not least, we should have to have open-minded, my friends. It's really, I'm saying, every time, some of our friends are very powerful, they are asking me, Santosh, don't stop asking questions. Let's push. But how many times I will be get disappointed to me? My question is that, why not there is answer for my question? If you say that there is a platform for you, then why not there is a question for my answer? And there is an answer for my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Santosh. Thank you so much. The one thing that Santosh said that I think is really important, because it doesn't necessarily come in the earlier two discussions, is that the community that she represents is actually cuts across. It's a cross-cutting community. There's no socio-economic barrier. There is no geopolitical barrier. It is just across. And the unfortunate thing is, the good news is that in some areas there is a voice that sort of articulates the position of this particular community. But there are some countries, for example in Africa and Uganda, where you can be killed, you can be put in jail if you come out as an LGBTQ member. And as a provider of health services, you can be penalized and held accountable for actually providing care to someone who's in the LGBTQ community. So there's quite a lot of work to be done and quite a lot of progress that has to be made in order for this community, actually for us to reach the last mile in this particular community. Our next speaker is Mr. Hiroaki Furihata. He is the domestic coordinator of South Africa Project, the Japan National Assembly of Disabled Peoples International, DPI Japan. Furihata was born in Nagano Prefecture and had a disability in 1982 with a sports accident. Since 2006, he takes in charge of international programs at Human Care Association in Hachioji-shi, Tokyo, since 2013. He's a domestic coordinator of DPI Japan's project to support establishment of independent living centers in South Africa under JICA Partnership Program. Now, Hiroaki, I asked him when I met him earlier, what are those things, in Japan you're walking on, I'm not from Japan, you're walking on the street and you see those grids and the yellow lines. And the first thing I said when I came to Japan was, why do they do this? This is, we are wearing high heels. How do we walk, on this pavement? What's going on in Japan? And I was so thrilled to actually hear that they're called tactile blocks and they are guides for the blind. And I said to myself, wow, Japan is so much ahead. Having come from a country like Ethiopia, and I live in Kenya where really the disability community is not prioritized in any way. So I'm so impressed by what I've seen so far in Japan. And I know that although while they're existing ISO minimum national standards, that obviously Japan may be probably one of the few countries that's following, for accessibility by persons with disabilities. When we consider the most vulnerable communities, it would seem that people with disabilities have a double burden. So one burden is, how do you get around? And the second, to even access care if you're in the last mile. But certainly the second one is, even if you are able to receive care at some health center somewhere far off, how do you get there and how's the infrastructure put together so that you can actually access care? So the questions I have for you are two questions. One is that people with disabilities are among actually the world's largest minority groups. So what are some of the considerations to ensure that this key population has access to quality healthcare and rehabilitative services? And then perhaps you can speak a little bit on the role of government should play to prioritize this. And then finally, what type of structural or other changes are needed in the health system to facilitate the inclusive health service to the grid?
Okay. Thank you very much, Nesta. As she introduced me, I'm working at DPI Japan. This is an organization by persons with disabilities, for persons with disabilities. And also I'm working at the Independent Living Center, Human Care Association, which work for advocacy of persons with disabilities and also provide necessary service for persons with disabilities to live in community, not in institutions or not into the care and the families like that, but to live in the community with their own determination, with their own will. So my activity is, my concern is how to bring this kind of environment or situation, community for persons with disabilities, not only in Japan but also in other countries, Southeast Asia or Africa, like that. So that's my work, to work with a person with disabilities in that country and then make a condition the person with disabilities live in community independently. Then from that work, I have many experience concerning to the health condition. My actual focus is social development, but health situation is really, really concerned with the living of person with disability. So as Esther asked me that, what makes them difficult to access to healthcare service, and what the policy and what the necessary change of system like that. I'd like to talk about this from my experience of this international cooperation. Actually, I work with many persons with disabilities in that country and support them for build capacity to lead the organization or work for persons with disabilities in the community. But I think in South Africa, we try to, how can I say, with the capacity of, I think, 20 to 25% with disabilities. But in the last 7 years, but already 6 of them passed away because of health condition. See, we consider what the problem of that. One is, then from that we learned that first, persons with disabilities have less knowledge on their own health condition relating to disabilities. For example, pressure sore or bed sore is, for example, like those who have cervical cord injury cannot feel their body when touch something. But from that, they have pressure, they make some kind of injured scars from that, but they can't recognize because they cannot feel from that because of cervical cord injury. Then come to the serious condition without knowing that, suddenly have an infection, then pass away. Such kind of cases happened twice with my friends, at least. I think more people with disabilities, cervical cord injury, have the same problem, but they don't know the seriousness of their health conditions because of lack of opportunity to know about it. And also a lack of opportunity to know about, for example, like nutrition, a diet. Or as Desta told us that 80% of the population of persons with disabilities in the poverty. So it's difficult to have a balanced nutrition from their knowledge. So that makes suffer like a diabetes or like a health condition. Then okay, that's lack of less knowledge on the health condition is one of the barriers persons with disabilities have. And then they find out, oh, I have a health problem, so must go to hospital. But there is another barrier come out. I need to go to hospital, but how can I go there? Because lack of transportation, or maybe lack of information of hospital, the available health service in the community. See, like me using a wheelchair, but many countries I worked upon, like Vietnam, Philippines, and Malaysia, South Africa. Now, there is a transportation, public transportation, but not accessible wheelchair users. And also there are barriers in the road, like gaps, no ramps. And then community barrier, no accessible transportation, then another barrier for persons with disabilities, access to healthcare service. Then, okay, somehow, I asked my friend, he asked my friend, his friend, and come to the hospital. But then what happens? First one is lack of information, accessible information. You know, disability is not only physical disabilities, but there are many types of various kinds of disabilities, like visual disabilities, hearing disabilities, also like cognitive disabilities, and like intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities, many kinds of, or psychosocial disabilities. And for example, like for a person with visual disabilities, a lack of information, like a braille or like a person with hearing disabilities, lack of way of sign language interpreters or communication, that makes them difficult to understand about the available healthcare service, healthcare information, or difficult to communicate with doctors, nurses, healthcare workers. That's another barrier. So accessibility of transportation, so accessibility of built environment is not accessible, and also accessibility of information is not enough. Then another barrier is a mindset of persons who work at the social health sector. Well, they maybe know about what kind of health problem they have, but they have less knowledge on issues of persons with disabilities. Like what kind of a background they have, what's the problem come from cervical cord injuries, what's the problem of like muscular dystrophies, or how they communicate with persons with disabilities. These kind of barriers, maybe less knowledge on the issue of persons with disabilities of those who are working at the healthcare service, but another barrier for persons with disabilities. And one of my friends told me when he went to hospital with his personal assistant, the doctors always talk to personal assistant but not to himself, right? This means that they don't know how to communicate with a person with disabilities, or maybe look down person with disabilities. They cannot do anything like that. So these are barriers person with disabilities faces when trying to access to healthcare services. So from that, maybe what can government do? And for that, the first one is raise awareness of personnel of healthcare sectors. They should know more about the persons with disabilities. What are disabilities? What they need? What's the problem they have? With that awareness, certainly change the behavior of personnel at healthcare service sector. And also need some policies to raise the awareness of persons with disabilities on their health situation, health condition. Many friends of disabilities, my friends of disability passed away because lack of knowledge on healthcare. So if they have some, maybe a situation is different. And another thing is this is not only an issue of healthcare service sector, but also this is an issue of community whole, entire society, like accessible environment, accessible transportation, and make a person with disabilities possible to come out with assist of, for example, like a personal assistant. This kind of policies and systems are necessary. And for that, very important thing is inclusion of persons with disabilities into the policy-making process. See, very important motto here is leave no one behind. But also we have very important motto as a movement of persons with disabilities, nothing about us without us. So when they think about the system of a healthcare system, reformation of a healthcare system, or provision of new policies, making accessible environment, participation of persons with disabilities into that process is very important. I think that inclusion is a very first step for change of system for persons with disabilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And actually, you touch upon some very key points, even pick up on a little bit of what Santosh said about our voice needs to be heard, and indeed that is quite true. So thank you so much. And again, this is a cross-cutting community. The community that is that has to deal with disabilities is no socio-economic, political, everybody across the board. So thank you so much for that. We'll move right along to Rachel. Rachel Ong is the regional coordinator for Global Fund Advocates Network Asia and Pacific. Rachel has worked with communities, the communities delegation to Global Fund Board since 2009 as the communication focal point, bless you. And she has occupied several governance, committee, leadership position roles in Global Fund process. So Rachel, you know, you've heard sort of everyone's perspective and where we're all coming from in terms of the last mile, and maybe your response may be a little bit different, but I let you answer. At center, UHC should really ensure the availability of fully resourced, community-led service delivery and fully resourced public facilities that don't discriminate, that provide the opportunity for multiple health needs to be addressed in one place. UHC provides the opportunity for real integration of HIV, TB, HIV prevention, other health-related needs, particularly sexual and reproductive health rights and services to respond to gender-based violence, etc. And also for those of us who are aging, for mental health care, for NCDs, nutrition support, etc. So the question I have for you is twofold. The first is around progress and how you can measure progress. How can progress be measured on reaching the marginalized and hard to reach? You just heard about a number of different groups. So how do we measure hard to reach key populations? You know, what's the role of improving data collection, etc.? And then number two, how can partnerships be leveraged to bridge critical gaps in access to universal health coverage for the most marginalized and hard to reach?
Thanks, Desta. Just to wake everybody up,
Please do.
can I just have people who are from a high-income country, can you please stand up? Okay. Can the people who know from these high-income countries, if you actually know someone that has a barrier in accessing healthcare, please remain standing. So the question is, if you are from a high-income country, but you still know somebody that still has access barriers towards healthcare, remain standing. So please take a seat. I won't go up to each and every, please sit down. Please sit down. Please sit down. No, I won't go up to each and every one of you to ask why, because the panelists before me have spoken very articulately around each and every single group having such different needs towards accessing health. Can I just have a raise of hands? You don't have to stand up. Those who are experts in public health or are already working in health. If you are working in health, can you please raise your hands? Okay, thank you. So this helps me formulate a little bit in terms of how I will respond. You can put your hands down. respond to the questions that were raised. So I suppose in terms of making sure that there's data collection, the role of data collection is one of the government. But that is also the role of civil society and communities. When we talk about data collection and the barriers or what needs to be looked at in collecting data, we face a couple of challenges. The first one is the data quality and also availability. So as many of our speakers have spoken, populations and communities that are criminalized most often will not provide their data at health service centers that they belong to a specific group. You will not expect to find good data then in many countries that criminalize sexual behaviors or sexual orientation and gender identities. And even for countries that also criminalize interpreters, if I'm speaking too fast, please wave at me because I have a habit of talking faster and faster because I'm nervous. And I also forget to breathe. But also professional acts. So sex workers are also criminalized. And you will not want to go into a service center to tick a box if you are belonging to one of these populations. And that will give you inaccurate data at the end of the day to how countries can program their services. And this is why the role of civil society and communities is so important, because they can collect that data in a non-discriminatory setting, where you will not be prosecuted for who you are and what you do. And that data can then help governments also in actually developing what is needed for these populations. A lot of times there's also the lack of granularity of the data. So when we talk about data, we also need to talk not just whether you're this gender, that gender, the third gender, or any of the LGBTIQ groups. You need to fill in also your age. And a lot of times, data is not collected consistently across. Especially also in malaria. So for our colleagues in African countries will understand how WHO collects the data. And a lot of times you don't actually have more granular data that shows you how children under 5 or which gender above 5 are being affected. But the issue about being able to collect data across populations is also one of the challenge. Because I know my colleagues in the trans community, they don't want to be, sometimes there's a challenge. They don't want to be identified as female. Sometimes they don't want to be identified as male. Or sometimes they don't want to be identified to be from the trans community and they want to be identified as the female community. So that also poses a challenge in countries for them to collect the data in an effective way. And the best solution for that is for the governments to sit down with the populations affected in developing how they want this data to be collected in a rights-based manner. Then there are two more issues, which is data accessibility, about how information is shared between entities at either a state level, provincial level, and at a federal level. And then data integration, where information and data is actually integrated between entities. So it could be between the Ministry of Health and funders. So sometimes you will also see that data can be very different in some reports. And the Ministry of Health reports might have different data from how countries actually submit their reports to PEPFAR, which is the largest funding bilateral in the world for HIV programs. One of the hardest things, and I will reiterate that, from the marginalized communities and the key populations is the growing conservatism in the world. In this region, we have the war on drugs in Philippines. We have Brunei, where we 2 weeks ago implemented Sharia law. And so men who have sex with men can be stoned to death. You have also Indonesia, where there are an increasing number of states where men who have sex with men and lesbians are also being criminalized. So how do we then actually talk about putting the last mile first? We keep saying that we need to reach the last mile, but that is not the motto. And it's not about leaving anybody behind, it's that we need to put these groups of people in the beginning and reach the people that are most in poverty, the people that have the most challenges in accessing UHC in the forefront. And so maybe just to answer the second question around partnerships. Japan has been a great supporter and leader in terms of many partnerships in the world, within the G20, within the other G7, G8 processes, in the UN systems, and also has increased its funding towards many multilateral institutions like Gavi, UNITAID, as well as the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria. For example, the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria actually has within its strategic objective 3 a specific objective that actually talks about promoting and protecting human rights and gender equality. The Global Fund actually is one of the largest multilateral financing mechanisms in the world, and all its funding programs actually work to ensure that you reach marginalized and key populations at the country level, and so trying and striving not to leave anyone behind. and therewith emphasizing the need for the C20 as well as the G20 processes to actually support and continue supporting the Global Fund as well as the other multilateral institutions that work on health in a very difficult global economy, especially when we are all working very hard to end the 3 disease epidemics, TB, HIV, TB, and malaria as we know them. And it would be a great contribution of Japan to actually show that leadership within the G20 processes.
Thank you so much. So we have a limited amount of time, and I'd like to ask you to do one thing. Give the audience, give the speakers a round of applause, please. So here's what we're going to do, and I've just changed the rules on you. I had told you you'd have a minute to recap, but in fact, it depends on what the audience says. So we'll go to the audience first. All of you have very interesting things. Let me take the first 3 questions. We're not going to leave any questions unanswered in this room. So, no questions unanswered, no one left behind. Let's take 3 questions for the panelists, if you have any. Right back there, there you go. This is what it means to reach the last mile. Don't give him that, that's too easy. The last mile. That's what it means. It means going across so many different rows of chairs to get to this guy and say to him,
okay, thank you. Congratulations for all panel. It's very good, your presentation or your answers. But I want to talk, we want to touch some issue is very important for me, because they play the very key role into the public health. Is about the price of medicines, or is about the pharma grids. Because, for example, the Global Fund is waiting for October, maybe $14 billion. For example, in United States, last year, the big pharma spent $6.4 billion in TB adversity to increase their earnings. And this is very, very important issue for us, because it's very important to know about the patents today are killing a lot of people. For that, I think so it's very important the C20 to touch this issue and work on this.
So I'm just going to ask you, just summarize, was that a question because it was a comment? Okay, let's see if we can get some questions. Thank you so much. Let's see if we can get some questions.
Yes, thank you so much for the presentation, Caterina Carvalho, International Planned Parenthood Federation. I think in all of the presentations, something that struck me is basically that all of you are talking about we need to listen to the community and we need to have a bottom-up approach. I would like, if you can, because it's beautiful to say we need the community, how? If you can give me 1 or 2 ideas on how we can go to talk with the governments and ensure that the community is heard. Give me concrete actions in order to have that and to advocate for that. And the other question, I have another question, sorry. It's, I don't heard anybody talking about health workers and how the role of the health workers in ensuring that no one is left behind. If you could please give me a little bit more your opinion on that, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to take 1 question. I think there's a question up here.
My name is Peter, Action Against AIDS from Germany. Thanks for your presentations, and of course, when you listened, it all was about access, and I think it all was about, for me, about structural barriers. I didn't hear the word prisoner. I did work in prison for an NGO, and I would say that's a huge sort of barrier that prisoners don't have access to treatment, to prevention, to condoms, to substitution treatment, whatever. But I have one very specific question, because you mentioned the criminalization cases, and there was this case it just happened a couple of weeks ago of Brunei that gay sex is sort of sentenced to death. So I just wonder, since this C20 takes place in Asia, would you think it's a good idea to mention that and to ask the Japanese government to address this specifically?
There are 3 questions on the table. Any one of our panelists want to take them? One is about community. The other one is about community health workers, and the third one is about the case of incarcerated, was it incarcerated or in Brunei? Criminalized.
I could go first, so I could take the easy one.
Okay, let's do 1 minute response. If you can do actually less than a minute, just
in response to Katarina's question in terms of concrete examples of how communities and civil society are actually meaningfully engaged in decision making. In the Philippines, the budgeting decision over health, the health budget, it's actually quite, how do you call this, advanced. There's a process that's called bottom-up budgeting. So the allocation for health, there's a process we're in civil society and people's organizations actually have a deliberation representing different communities and society and present to the Ministry of Finance their proposals on how the allocation should be, and this gets considered and they actually get funded. But the question is, of course, the more savvy communities and civil society groups are able to budget properly. So there's also the question of making sure that communities and civil society are actually supported, the capacity is built so that they're able to engage in decision-making processes around financing, etc. Another example, we've heard it throughout the summit actually, is making sure that communities and civil society are part of decision-making boards. For example, in the Global Fund, they actually have a voting seat at the country level. They sit in the country coordinating mechanism that provides oversight to how funds are actually implemented and used.
Thank you, Roniman. I was just going to interrupt you, but let's start over there. One word in terms of engagement of either community health workers or engaging community. If we can have one sentence from each of you.
One word.
Our time is running.
One word would be.
One word.
Oh, it was on? Now it's on?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Now, one word is that we have been always talking about shrinking civic space for civil society. Shrinking space for civil society. And I think that is a very complex concept, really, because civil society is different, in any country that it is working. It has to do with the political issues that govern each country. And so we find that countries are, civil society is doing much more work and much more able to work with those left behind communities and those grassroots organizations according to if the political situation in each country. But at the end of the road, solidarity is everywhere, and in each country, organizations start moving and start working.
Very long way from Venezuela. It's a very long one word.
Well,
Thank you so much, though.
So maybe I'll just respond. I'll respond really quickly to the issue around the price of medicines. May I remind all of you that your governments have the responsibility around the use of TRIPS flexibilities. And our role at the country level would then be to advocate for countries to be able to access lower and cheaper drugs through ensuring and TRIPS flexibilities. Can I have one sentence for one issue? Then around the bottom-up approach, we talk a lot about political leadership, but the other thing is the willingness at the end of the day in countries to be able to implement what's needed. just touching quickly on Katerina's issue around community health workers, it was very clearly seen around their role, especially during the Ebola crisis. And with the push towards leaving no one behind and in the universal health coverage agenda, the issue around community health workers is the demands that are being made on them, because they are expected to cover more and more issues and diseases over larger areas. So there is definitely a focus that's needed on community health workers. Just around structural barriers, trying to pronounce it properly in German, around prisoners. I think one of the key things that we've learned I come from the AIDS movement, and having been working in the AIDS movement for the past 20 years, I'm going to slow down, I think they need to catch up.
Please stop this.
It's the fact that you realize that you do not belong to one group. So as a woman, you can live with HIV, you can be 13 to 18 at one point of your life, and after that 18 to 24, and then 24 and above. And at every different stage of your life, you have different needs towards healthcare. You will have different needs towards sexual and reproductive health and rights. You will then also, if living with HIV, once you pass 35 or 40, you will be living with age. So you will also have issues around dementia, around issues that, as a human being, you will have different spectrums of life. So I think in the issues around criminalized populations and marginalized populations, as well as with different populations of people and communities of people, there is the main issue about leaving no one behind, or I like to call it putting the last mile first, is making sure that we do not silo everyone, and that we're working together cohesively to get a rights-based approach towards leaving no one behind.
That's an excellent point. I'm going to come Andres with you, and because you answered the first easy question, and come over here. Do you have anything to add? Do you have anything to add to that?
About bottom up from community for community building. When we start support for other countries, person with disabilities, we not forget how to make a channel with government. So not only work for community, but also we always think how to make a channel between community or person with disabilities and several levels of government, like a local level, prefecture or state level or national level. Then, because each government have a section for persons with disabilities, so by making a channel for that, anyhow, try to bring a voice from the community, the person with disabilities, not stay inside the community, must reach to the government level. That's what we're trying to do. And also the community health worker, but not the community health worker, but we try to make a capacity of persons with disabilities can work as a peer supporters in the community. So they can make a counseling with the person with disabilities. Person with disabilities counsel to the person with disabilities. Also can share information, can share their experience, not only living in the community, but also regarding the healthcare issues. So person with disabilities also can work as a peer supporter, like healthcare workers in the community. And also an issue of, how can I say, human rights violation. Human rights issue must be included in the issue of G20 government discussion. So maybe there are many other issues like economic issues, the political relationships are very sensitive, but human rights also must be included in the G20 discussion.
Thank you very much. I think our time is up. We've overextended. Thank you to the audience. Thank you, please, to our panelists. Very gracious to be here. I'm assuming they will remain here until tomorrow. And if you have any specific remarks, questions, you can ask them directly. Thank you so much for allowing us.